The smoke hit the 12th floor before a single alarm sounded. Because someone made sure they wouldn't. Hundreds of people were trapped inside a burning luxury hotel, and the one man who had warned them, the quiet nobody in the worn work jacket, the building inspector nobody bothered to learn the name of, was already running back in. Not because he was paid to, not because anyone asked him to, because a woman was still up there, and she had maybe 4 minutes of breathable air left. What Roland Keswick didn't know, what none of them knew, was exactly who they had been dismissing all day. If this is your first time here, welcome. And please take a second right now to hit that subscribe button and tap the like before we go any further. This channel is where stories like this one live stories about the people everyone overlooks until the moment nobody else can step up. New episodes drop regularly, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. And drop a comment below telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. It genuinely means everything to know where you're watching from. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Brennan Daxley pulled his pickup into the Aldercrest Meridian's service entrance at 7:43 in the morning, and the valet who watched him park didn't bother walking over. That was fine. Brennan wasn't there for the valet. He killed the engine and sat for a moment in the cab, reviewing the inspection order on his clipboard. The Aldercrest Meridian was 41 stories of glass and polished stone in the center of the city, the kind of building that had its own Wikipedia page and a waiting list for weekend bookings. It had hosted 3 sitting senators, 2 foreign heads of state, and 1 very public celebrity divorce proceeding in the last calendar year alone. The hotel's ownership group, Keswick Hospitality Partners, was currently preparing the building for what was being called the most significant private defense technology summit of the decade, which was exactly why the city had ordered an independent safety inspection. Which was exactly why Brennan was here with a clipboard and a flashlight and a $23 pair of work boots he'd bought on sale 8 months ago. He climbed out, tucked the clipboard under his arm, and walked toward the service entrance. The morning air was sharp and cold. He'd left Tessa at school 40 minutes earlier, standing at the curb with her backpack and her earbuds already in, barely looking up when he said goodbye. 13 was that age. He knew it. He didn't take it personally, or he tried not to. Call me after school, he'd said. Dad. She'd said it like the word itself was an eye roll. I know. Call me anyway. She had walked away without answering. He'd watched her go through the school doors and then sat in the pickup for a moment longer than he needed to before pulling out of the lot. That was this morning. This was now. He had a job to do. The building's facilities manager, a nervous man named Gordon Pruett, met Brennan in the service corridor with a laminated visitor badge and a look that suggested he'd been hoping the inspector would cancel. Mr. Daxley. Gordon shook his hand. Firm enough to be professional, quick enough to communicate that he had other places to be. We appreciate you being punctual. I have to be up front. We're running a very tight schedule this week with the summit setup, so we're hoping to move through your checklist as efficiently as possible. I'll move at the pace the building requires, Brennan said. Gordon's expression shifted slightly. Of course. I just meant, I understand what you meant. Brennan looked down at the badge Gordon had handed him and clipped it to his jacket. Let's start with the mechanical room on sublevel 2. They started there. By the time Brennan reached the 3rd floor, he had already noted 2 items that made him slow down. A fire door on the north corridor that was being propped open with a rubber wedge, someone's idea of convenience during the setup chaos, and a smoke detector on the ceiling above the housekeeping. Supply closet that had been covered with a plastic bag. A plastic bag secured with a rubber band. He photographed both. Wrote both down. Said nothing yet. Gordon walked beside him and talked almost continuously about the summit, about the distinguished guests expected, about what a remarkable achievement it was for the hotel to have secured this event. Brennan listened without responding much. He was paying attention to the building, not to Gordon. By the 8th floor, the picture was getting worse. The ventilation system on the east side of the building had been modified. Not catastrophically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone who hadn't spent years learning exactly what normal looked like in mechanical systems, but modified. Dampers repositioned. Airflow patterns that didn't match the building's original specifications. Brennan crouched in a mechanical access corridor for 6 minutes, tracing ductwork with his flashlight, while Gordon stood in the hallway outside and checked his phone. Brennan wrote down what he found. Then he stood up, brushed dust off his knees, and kept going. By the 12th floor, he had seen enough. He came out of the last inspection point, the large conference suite corridor near the east stairwell, and found Gordon waiting with his arms crossed and the particular impatience of a man who believed he'd been very patient already. "We need to talk," Brennan said. "Of course. Was there anything?" "Smoke detectors on floors 8, 11, and 12 have been disabled or covered. 3 of them. The east stairwell has structural concerns in the lower landing, probably deferred maintenance that make it unreliable as an evacuation route. The ventilation modifications on the east side of the building create a condition where smoke, in the event of a fire, would be drawn upward rather than vented out. And the fire doors on 6 and 9 are being left open during setup, which—" Mr. Daxley. Gordon's voice had changed, still controlled, but with something tightening underneath it. "Some of those items, the detectors in particular, those are temporary precautions. The summit setup creates a lot of dust and particulate in the air, and false alarms during a VIP event are extremely problematic. The covered detectors are a standard practice that's been approved by—" "Not by the fire code," Brennan said, "and not by me." The silence that followed was the kind that happened when someone said a thing plainly that the other person had been hoping to avoid hearing, said plainly. "I need to recommend a 72-hour delay," Brennan continued. "The summit should not proceed in this building until these systems are restored and the ventilation issue is properly assessed." Gordon stared at him. "Mr. Daxley, do you understand what you're saying? This summit—" "I understand what I'm saying. Involves defense contractors, government officials, and a CEO who has been on 3 national morning programs this week promoting this demonstration. Mr. Keswick, personally, I'm not asking about Mr. Keswick's schedule," Brennan said. "I'm telling you what I observed in this building and what my professional recommendation is. What happens after that is your decision and your organization's. But my report is going to say what I found." Gordon looked at him for a long moment. Then he said carefully, "Mr. Keswick will want to speak with you directly." Roland Keswick was not a man who had ever learned to be wrong gracefully. He was 61 years old, thick-shouldered and silver-haired, and he had spent 4 decades building a hospitality empire that bore his name on buildings in 9 cities. He met Brennan in the hotel's executive suite on the 35th floor, and the room alone was designed to make a man in a $23 pair of work boots feel like he'd wandered into the wrong building. There was a woman already in the room. She was standing near the windows, half turned toward the view, and she looked up when Brennan entered with Gordon. She was younger than Roland by at least 25 years, late 20s or very early 30s. Brennan guessed, and she wore the kind of clothes that cost what he made in a month, without looking like they did. She was sharp-featured and watchful, and she had a tablet in one hand, and the expression of someone who had been in the middle of an important conversation when she'd been asked to wait. "Marielle Voss," Gordon murmured beside Brennan, low enough that it wasn't quite an introduction. "CEO of Voss Defense Technologies. Her demonstration is scheduled for tomorrow." Brennan looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that's been placed in an inconvenient location, not hostility exactly, just a kind of impersonal assessment that concluded he was not relevant. Roland crossed the room with his hand extended. The handshake was the kind that came with a small, carefully calibrated pressure, not enough to be aggressive, just enough to establish something. "Mr. Daxley, Roland Keswick." He said his own name the way people do when they expect it to mean something. "Gordon tells me you've raised some concerns about our building systems." "That's one way to put it," Brennan said. Roland smiled. It was a practiced smile. "Why don't you walk me through what you found? I've been in this industry for 40 years. I've seen a lot of inspection reports. I want to make sure we're interpreting your findings correctly." Brennan walked him through it, concisely, specifically, without softening anything. He described each item: the disabled detectors, the ventilation modification, the stairwell condition, the propped fire doors, and he described what each one meant in practical terms. Not in terms of code citations or regulatory language. In terms of what could happen. Roland listened with the patient expression of a man enduring something he found mildly tedious. "Those detectors," he said when Brennan finished, "are a standard precaution we've taken during setup for every major event for the past 6 years. We have had 0 incidents. You've been fortunate, Brennan said. Roland's smile shifted slightly. Or we've been professionally managed. The ventilation modification isn't a minor concern. Someone altered the airflow patterns on the east side of this building. I don't know why, and I don't know when, but if there's a combustion event on one of those floors. A combustion event, Roland repeated, with a small edge of amusement in his voice that he didn't quite bother concealing. Mr. Daxley, this is a luxury hotel, not a chemical plant. What do you imagine is going to combust? Electrical systems, aged wiring under load, overheated equipment during a high-capacity event. It doesn't take much. Brennan looked at him steadily. I'm recommending a 72-hour delay. The room went quiet. Marielle Voss spoke for the first time. Her voice was controlled and precise. A 72-hour delay is not possible. I have government officials flying in tonight. I have a demonstration scheduled for tomorrow afternoon that has been coordinated for 8 months. A delay of that kind would— I understand that, Brennan said. Do you? She set the tablet down on the chair beside her. She wasn't hostile exactly, but she had the focus of someone who had spent years dealing with obstacles efficiently. My company's contract with the Defense Procurement Office is contingent on this demonstration. Not eventually contingent, immediately contingent. A 72-hour delay effectively cancels it. That's a business problem, Brennan said. I'm identifying a safety problem. Those are two different things, and they have to be treated as two different things. She looked at him for a moment, and in your professional assessment as an independent building inspector, you are confident that this building poses an imminent danger to several hundred guests. The way she said independent building inspector was not cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was something more efficient than either of those, a quiet, factual designation that placed him very precisely in a category of people whose assessments she had already evaluated against the cost of accommodating them. I'm confident in what I observed, Brennan said, and I'm confident that once a building begins failing, the things in that room don't negotiate with the outcome. He glanced briefly at Roland. The money, the contracts, the guest list. None of it changes what fire does. Roland leaned back slightly. Mr. Daxley, I appreciate your thoroughness. I really do. We will have our own engineering team review your notes, and we'll make sure every item is properly addressed before the summit begins tomorrow. You have my word on that. Your word isn't a working smoke detector, Brennan said. The silence after that one was a different quality than the ones before it. Roland looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, in the way that people nod when they've decided a conversation is over. Gordon will show you out and make sure your parking is validated. Thank you for your time. Brennan looked at Roland, then at Marielle. She had already looked away, back toward the window, already thinking about something else. He picked up his clipboard. He walked out. He sat in the pickup for a while in the service parking lot, engine off, staring at his inspection notes. Then he called his contact at the City Building Authority and gave a verbal preliminary report, enough to create a record, enough to flag the concerns formally. The woman on the other end, a code enforcement supervisor he'd worked with before named Dana Reese, listened without interrupting. I'm going to put together the written report tonight, Brennan, and said. But I want it on record now that I recommended a delay and that the recommendation was declined by ownership. Understood, Dana said. Brennan, do you think they'll actually address the items? He looked at the hotel's service entrance for a moment. A catering truck was backing in. A porter was loading luggage onto a cart. The machine of a functioning luxury hotel was moving smoothly around him, indifferent and enormous. No, he said, I don't. He drove to pick Tessa up from school. She was waiting on the curb, backpack at her feet, earbuds in, looking at her phone. She climbed into the truck without looking up. How was it? He asked. Fine. He pulled out of the school lot. The afternoon was getting gray at the edges, the way it did when the temperature was going to drop after dark. I've got a thing tonight, he said. I might need to go back to the building I was inspecting. It depends. Tessa looked up from her phone. Is it important? He thought about the covered smoke detector, the ventilation dampers, the propped fire door on the 9th floor. Probably nothing, he said. I'll be home for dinner either way. She looked at him for a half-second longer than she normally would have, with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she put her earbuds back in and looked out the window. He drove home, Made dinner pasta, garlic bread that came out slightly burned on one side. The same salad they had 3 times a week because it was the one Tessa would actually eat. They sat at the table, and Tessa told him, in fragments between bites, about something that had happened in her English class involving a group project and a girl named Priya, who kept changing the topic. Brennan listened, asked questions, kept most of his attention exactly where it was supposed to be. But some part of him, the part that never entirely shut off, the part that had kept him alive through things he did not talk about, kept returning to the 12th floor of the Aldercrest Meridian, to the covered detectors, to the modified ventilation, to the faint specific smell he had caught near the east mechanical panel. Not quite wrong, but not quite right. Once a building begins failing, he had told Roland Keswick, the things in that room don't negotiate with the outcome. He cleared the table, washed the dishes, said goodnight to Tessa, drove back to the hotel. He was sitting in the parking structure across the street, engine off, when he first noticed the lights on the 12th floor flicker. Just once, just briefly, he was already reaching for the door handle. Then the smell reached him even across the street, faint and unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for, the sharp, acrid bite of electrical insulation beginning to burn. And every single thing he had warned them about began happening at once. The flicker lasted less than a second. One moment, the 12th floor windows were lit the warm amber of a hotel in full operation chandeliers, wall sconces, the glow of laptop screens and standing lamps in a corridor being prepared for tomorrow's summit. And the next moment, everything above the 10th floor went dark in a single, clean drop. The way power dies when something fundamental has failed rather than tripped. Brennan was already out of the truck. He didn't run. Running in a parking structure draws attention and burns energy you might need later. He walked fast, the kind of fast that looks purposeful rather than panicked, and he was already pulling out his phone and dialing 911 before he reached the street. This is Brennan Daxley. I'm a licensed building safety inspector, and I'm reporting a potential fire emergency at the Aldercrest Meridian Hotel. He gave the address. He gave his name and his certification number from memory. I conducted an inspection of this building today and documented disabled smoke detection systems on floors 8, 11, and 12, along with compromised ventilation on the east side. I am on site. I am going in. The dispatcher started to tell him to wait for fire units. Units are going to need to know which stairwells are safe, he said. The east stairwell has structural concerns in the lower landing. Tell responding units to use the west and northwest access points. He ended the call. The Meridian's main entrance was already showing the first signs of what was coming, a thin haze at ceiling level in the lobby that most people would have taken for a trick of the light or a problem with the ventilation. A bellman near the door was frowning up at it. A couple near the check-in desk had stopped their conversation and were looking at each other with the uncertain expressions of people who knew something was off but hadn't yet committed to the word wrong. Brennan walked through the main doors. The smell hit him harder inside. Sharp and chemical, not wood smoke, not the familiar smell of something burning in a kitchen. This was electrical. Insulation. The smell of wiring that had been carrying more load than it was built for and had finally given up on the argument. He found a hotel employee near the concierge desk, young, maybe 22, in the Meridian's burgundy uniform, looking at the ceiling with his hands slightly away from his body in the posture of someone who has no idea what to do next. Hey, Brennan stopped in front of him. What's your name? The young man looked at him. Marcus, I'm Brennan Daxley. I inspected this building today. I need you to listen to me carefully. He kept his voice even and direct, not raised, not performing urgency, just stating facts in a sequence. There is a fire developing in this building. Fire units are already en route. I need you to get to your emergency panel wherever your station emergency panel is, and I need you to trigger the manual alarm for floors 10 through 15. Not the whole building yet. Can you do that? Marcus stared at him. Sir, I'm not authorized to. The detectors on those floors were disabled, Brennan said. The automatic system isn't going to catch this in time. Where is your panel? Something in Marcus's face shifted. Brennan had seen that shift before, the moment when a person stops waiting for someone else to be in charge and accepts that the situation has made that decision for them. Back of house, Marcus said, behind the kitchen corridor. Go, right now. Trigger floors 10 through 15 manually. Then get back out here and start directing guests toward the west exits. West only. Don't let anyone use the east stairwell. Marcus went. Brennan moved. He took the west stairwell to the second floor, where he found the elevator control panel in the service corridor. He'd noted its location during the inspection, and he pulled the elevator override, dropping all 4 elevator cars to ground level and locking them there. In an evacuation, elevators kill people. They open on smoke-filled floors, trap passengers between floors when power fails, and create bottlenecks that compress into disasters. He left them grounded. Back in the west stairwell, he could already hear the alarm beginning a delayed, imperfect response because Marcus had found the panel and done what he'd been told. The sound was wrong, partial, missing the lower floor triggers, but it was something. It would start people moving. On the 4th floor, he encountered the first real problem. A group of 8 or 9 guests had gathered at the east stairwell door, which was blocked by a heavy-set man in a conference lanyard who was insisting that this was a false alarm and that everyone should proceed normally. He'd apparently been to events with false alarms before and had opinions about them. Brennan pushed through the group. East stairwell is not safe for evacuation. Everyone needs to move back to the west stairwell. He put a hand on the heavy-set man's arm, not rough, just present. "Sir, I need you to move away from this door." "Who are you?" the man demanded. He had the voice of someone accustomed to being the loudest person in a meeting. "I'm not taking instructions from... I'm the building inspector who inspected this building today and documented a structural issue in this stairwell." Brennan looked at him steadily. "You can stand here and be right, or you can move. Those are your options." Something in the way he said it quiet and final, and completely without the anxious edge that most people carry when they're trying to convince someone of something, made the man step back. "West stairwell," Brennan said to the group now. "Single file, stay right. Keep moving." They moved. He worked his way up floor by floor in a pattern that was not instinct, it was training, compressed into habits so deep it had become something he could access without consciously reaching for it. Floor by floor, corridor by corridor, he moved through the building the way he'd moved through structures in environments far more dangerous than this, and the knowledge he'd spent the day gathering the floor plan, the access points, the mechanical layouts, the location of every disabled detector and compromised door, organized itself into a working picture of the building's failure in real time. The smoke was bad on 10, thicker on 11. By the time he reached the 11th floor corridor, it was low enough that he was ducking below it, and he could see the orange glow beginning at the far end of the east corridor, not flame yet, not at this point, but the reflected light of something burning hard 2 floors below that was pushing heat upward through the ventilation channels he'd identified that morning. The modified dampers, the repositioned airflow, he'd told them. He'd told them exactly what those modifications would do. He got the last 3 guests off 11, a couple, and an elderly woman who'd been trying to help the couple find the stairwell and got them moving down. The elderly woman had a cane and moved slowly, and the man from the couple, young, early 30s, clearly frightened, started to hurry ahead of her. "Slow down," Brennan said. "She's with you. You don't leave her." The young man stopped, looked back. Something passed across his face that was complicated and probably would take him a while to think through. He went back and offered his arm, and the 3 of them went down the stairwell together. Brennan went up. The 12th floor corridor was the worst he'd encountered. The smoke was ceiling to waist height, gray-brown and dense, and the heat was pressing in from the east end, where the electrical failure had originated in a junction box that should have been replaced 2 maintenance cycles ago, but hadn't been because, Brennan would later learn, the replacement had been flagged as non-urgent and pushed back 3 times when the budget review moved funds toward lobby renovation. He pulled his collar up over his mouth and nose, inadequate, but better than nothing, and he moved fast and low through the corridor, checking each room. Most were empty. The summit guests were primarily on upper floors, and the 12th floor at this hour had been mostly meeting spaces and the conference suite being prepared for tomorrow's demonstration. 3 rooms clear. 4. The 5th room had a family, 2 adults and a child, maybe 7 years old, who had pulled the bedspread off the bed and was holding it in front of him with the solemn, focused expression of a child who has decided this is armor. The mother was on the phone with 911. The father was at the window, trying to assess the drop. "Don't open that window," Brennan said sharply from the doorway. You pull outside air in, you feed the fire. Come with me right now. They came. The child kept the bedspread. Brennan didn't argue about the bedspread. He got them to the Northwest Service stairwell, a secondary access route he'd noted during inspection, narrow and utilitarian, not on the standard evacuation signage, and sent them down with clear instructions. Bottom floor. Out the service exit on the north side of the building. Cross the street. Stay there. He went back into the corridor. That was when Hector found him. Hector Ruiz was 28 years old, Marielle Voss's junior logistics coordinator, and he'd been running since the alarm sounded, trying to account for everyone on his team. He came out of the stairwell door at the west end of the corridor, saw Brennan, and crossed the distance between them in a near sprint. You're the inspector, Hector said. He was breathing hard and his eyes were red from the smoke. From this morning, you warned them. There was something in his voice that was not quite accusation and not quite relief. I need to Ms. Voss. I can't find Ms. Voss. Brennan looked at him. What floor was she on? She was on 14. But I talked to Chen, he's her head of security, and Chen said she came down. Hector grabbed Brennan's arm. She came to 12. She came back for the drive. What drive? The demonstration data. Hector's voice cracked slightly at the edges. It's a physical drive, the prototype data, and the operational specifications, the whole thing. She has it in a security case in the conference suite here on 12. She doesn't trust cloud systems for classified specs. She said she told Chen she was just going to grab it and come right back down, that it would take 2 minutes. Brennan turned and looked down the corridor. The smoke was thicker than it had been 4 minutes ago. The heat was building at the east end, where the conference suite was located. He turned back to Hector. How long ago? 7 minutes. Maybe 8. 8 minutes in that corridor without protection was not a minor problem. Get downstairs, Brennan said. You can't. Brennan looked at him directly. You'd make it worse. Get out of the building, cross to the north side of the street, and tell the fire commander when they arrive that there is a civilian trapped on 12 in the east conference suite. Tell them the east stairwell is compromised and the northwest service access is clear. Can you remember that? Hector repeated it back, stumbling slightly over northwest service access and then getting it right. Go, Brennan said. Hector went. Brennan stood in the smoke-thickened corridor for exactly 2 seconds. Not hesitating, processing. He ran the floor plan through his mind the way he'd walked it 10 hours earlier, and he located the conference suite, the path to it, the 2 possible approaches, the one that would put him into heavier smoke, and the one that would keep him lower and faster. He thought about Tessa, not in an elaborate way, not with language. Just her face briefly, the way it looked when she was reading unguarded, soft, completely unself-conscious. The face she never showed him on purpose. Then he moved. The east end of the corridor was significantly worse than the middle. The smoke was floor-to-ceiling past the midway point, and Brennan dropped to his hands and knees and moved fast along the baseboard, where the air was marginally clearer, his eyes streaming and the heat pressing against the left side of his face from behind a door that had become a barrier between the corridor and something much worse on the other side. The conference suite was the last door on the right. It was closed, which had slowed the smoke intrusion. He pressed the back of his hand to the door surface warm, but not the searing heat of a door backing directly onto active flame. He opened it. The suite was large, 30 feet from door to the far wall of windows, with a long conference table running its length and portable presentation equipment staged along the sides for tomorrow's demonstration. The smoke in here was lighter than the corridor, a gray haze at ceiling level still, rather than the heavy blanket outside, and the air was breathable if not clean. Marielle Voss was on the floor near the far end of the conference table. She had made it to the security case, a hard-shell black case the size of a carry-on bag, which was open on the table beside her, and Brennan could see she'd retrieved something from it, a drive cartridge that she was still holding loosely in her right hand. But she'd gone down somewhere between the table and the door. She was conscious barely. She raised her head when Brennan crossed the room toward her, and her eyes tracked him, but her movements were slow and disconnected, the heavy-limbed unresponsiveness of someone whose body had started making decisions she hadn't authorized yet. "I've got you," he said. He didn't say anything else, no reassurance, no narration of what was happening. He slipped the drive cartridge out of her hand and dropped it into the breast pocket of his jacket, pulled the security case shut, and left it. He could carry one thing or the other, not both, and the person outweighed the equipment, and he got his arm under her shoulders and lifted. She was not light in the way that the word carried sometimes implies. She was a grown woman who had lost the ability to help support herself, and getting her vertical took real effort. He got her over his shoulders in a carry that distributed her weight across his back, steadied himself, and turned toward the door. "I can," she started. "You can't," he said. "Don't fight me." She stopped fighting him. He moved back through the suite and into the corridor, and the smoke hit them both. He felt her cough against his shoulder, felt her hand grip his jacket. He stayed low, moving as fast as the weight and the visibility allowed, past the midpoint of the corridor, past the point where the air started to clear slightly, keeping to the northwest wall that he'd tracked on the way in. He was halfway to the service stairwell when he saw the man. He almost missed it. His eyes were streaming, and his focus was on the path ahead and on managing Marielle's weight on his shoulders. And the figure was moving with a specific, practiced effort not to be noticed close to the wall, moving in the direction opposite the evacuation, toward the east end of the corridor rather than away from it. But Brennan had spent years noticing things that were moving wrong in environments where everything was already chaotic, and something in the way the man moved, purposeful, specific, unhurried in a way that had nothing to do with confusion, snagged his attention the way a wrong note snags the ear. The man was a hotel security employee. Brennan recognized the uniform from the morning, the charcoal jacket with the Meridian's discreet crest on the chest. He was carrying a hard case. Not the security case from the conference suite. Brennan had left that behind. A different case. One that bore Marielle Voss's company logo on its side panel. The man disappeared around the East Corridor junction without looking back. Brennan stood in the smoke for a half second with Marielle's weight on his shoulders and the image of the man's retreating back, and that logo on the case burning into his memory with the particular clarity that adrenaline sometimes produces, sharp-edged and permanent. Then he moved, because he had a half-conscious CEO on his shoulders and a service stairwell 20 feet ahead, and some things had to come in the right order. He got Marielle to the service stairwell. He got them both through the door. In the stairwell, the air was dramatically cleaner, and he heard Marielle pull in a long, ragged breath, and then another, and felt some of the tension go out of her body as the oxygen registered. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes, a pause, maybe." "Try." He kept his hand on her arm, and she walked unsteadily, one hand trailing the wall, but under her own power, and they went down the service stairs together, floor by floor, the sound of the alarm and distant shouting filtering through the walls, and the smell of smoke fading with each landing they cleared. At the ground floor, Brennan pushed the service exit open, and they came out into the night air on the north side of the building. The scene outside had transformed in the 20-odd minutes he'd been inside. 3 fire engines were positioned on the main avenue, with a 4th pulling in from the north end of the block. Police units had set up a perimeter that was still loose and disorganized. They'd arrived fast, but the coordination hadn't caught up yet. An ambulance was staged near the main entrance, and the sidewalk and street were full of hotel guests in varying states of distress, some still in robes and slippers, some still holding drinks from the bar, some on their phones, some just standing and staring at the building with the stunned expressions of people whose context has shifted faster than their minds could follow. Hector Ruiz spotted them from across the service lane and ran over. Behind him came a tall man in a dark jacket who introduced himself as Chen Bao, Marielle's head of security, and whose relief at seeing his employer upright was visible even in the bad light. "Ms. Voss." Chen caught her arm. "I'm fine." She pulled in another breath. "I'm fine." She straightened up from the slight lean she'd been using against the building wall, and Brennan watched the self-possession settle back into her posture with visible effort, not pretending she was fine. Exactly. But not willing to be seen as anything other than capable. "Where's the rest of the team?" "Accounted for," Hector said quickly. "Everyone's out." She nodded. Then she turned and looked at Brennan. He was leaning against the wall beside the service exit, hands on his knees, catching his breath. His jacket was marked with soot along the left shoulder. His eyes were still red and streaming slightly. He straightened when she looked at him. "You came back up," she said. "You were still in the building. You didn't know that when you went up." "I knew someone was," he said. "Your staff told me." She looked at him for a moment. In the chaotic half-light of the emergency scene, with fire engines repositioning, and the alarm still audible through the building's walls, and the crowd noise, and the radio chatter of responders, there was a beat of quiet between them that didn't fit the surrounding noise at all. "I owe you an apology," she said, "about this morning. You don't need to do that right now. I know I don't need to." She held his gaze. "I dismissed you. You were right about everything, and I decided your job title was more relevant than your information, and I dismissed you." Brennan looked at her for a moment. He didn't argue with the characterization, because it was accurate. "Apology noted," he said. That's it, he said. "We can have the rest of the conversation when the building isn't on fire." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but close enough to one. "Fair." Brennan straightened fully and looked back at the building, and at the security perimeter, and at the crowd, and his mind was already moving back to the man in the charcoal jacket, and the hard case with Marielle Voss's company logo on its side panel. The man who had been moving toward the east end of a smoke-filled 12th floor corridor. Moving toward the building, not away from it, carrying a case that shouldn't have been there. In the direction of an exit that, Brennan now understood, someone had known about and planned to use. Fire departments cleared buildings from the outside in, accounting for evacuees, tracking the perimeter. In a chaotic emergency evacuation with hundreds of guests, a man in a hotel security uniform moving purposefully through the confusion was almost invisible. Almost. Brennan pushed off the wall. "I need to talk to whoever's commanding the response," he said to Chen. "Right now." Chen looked at him. "Why?" What? Because this fire didn't start by accident," Brennan said, "and whoever set it in motion is still inside that perimeter." The night air was cold and sharp around them, and the Meridian's upper floors were lit now with the moving white beams of fire department operations, and somewhere in the controlled chaos of the sealed block, a man with a case was looking for a way out that nobody had thought to cover. Not yet, but Brennan was already walking. The incident commander's name was Captain Vera Oduya, and she had been running fire response operations for 19 years, which meant she had developed a very precise instinct for the difference between civilians who approached the perimeter because they were frightened and civilians who approached it because they had something useful to say. Brennan Daxley fell into the second category. She could tell within the first 30 seconds. He found her at the mobile command unit positioned on the north side of the avenue, a woman in her late 40s with close-cropped, gray-streaked hair and the particular economy of movement that came from years of making decisions in loud, chaotic environments. He introduced himself, name, certification number, the fact that he had inspected the building that morning and had been inside during the evacuation, and then he told her about the man in the charcoal security jacket. Oduya listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him for a beat. "You're certain it was a Voss Technologies case? I saw the logo on the panel." "Same logo that's on the equipment cases staged in the conference suite. I was in that suite 20 minutes ago." Description of the individual. Male, approximately 5'11", 180 to 190. Dark hair, shorter on the sides. Meridian security uniform, charcoal jacket. He was moving east on 12, toward the service junction. He knew where he was going, not someone who was lost or disoriented. Purposeful movement, close to the wall. Oduya turned to the officer beside her and gave 2 rapid instructions, one to tighten the east perimeter exit points, one to pull the hotel's security supervisor to the command unit immediately. Then she looked back at Brennan. "Stay here." "There's something else," Brennan said. She paused. "The fire. The junction box failure on 12 that's not a random equipment failure. I documented the ventilation modifications this morning. Those modifications were specific. They would have required someone with access to the mechanical systems and enough knowledge to alter the damper configuration without triggering an alarm during the change." He paused. "That's not a maintenance worker cutting corners. That's preparation." Oduya held his gaze for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, exactly. Something more like the look of a person who has been hoping a situation was one thing and is now accepting that it's another. "I'll need your full inspection report. I'll have it to you within the hour." She nodded once, turned back to her command unit, and was already on the radio before he'd taken 2 steps towards the perimeter. Chen Bao was waiting for him near the ambulance staging area, where 2 paramedics had gotten Marielle into the back of the vehicle for an oxygen assessment she was visibly resisting. Brennan could see her through the open rear doors, sitting upright on the gurney with an oxygen mask that she kept moving away from her face to talk, and one of the paramedics kept moving it back with the patient persistence of someone who had stopped being surprised by this behavior. "They want to take her to the hospital," Chen said. "She should go. She's refusing. That's her call." Brennan looked at Chen directly. The case, the man was carrying the one with the company logo. "What was in it?" Chen's jaw tightened. "Tell me what you saw exactly." Brennan described it again. The hard case, the panel logo, the size roughly equivalent to a large equipment case, the kind used for transporting sensitive electronics. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully the tactical communications prototype. The demonstration unit. It was in a Voss-branded transport case in the secure equipment room adjacent to the conference suite. He looked at Brennan. "I locked that room myself at 6 o'clock this evening. Access required a key card and a PIN. Who had access?" "My team, Ms. Voss. The hotel's head of security, because the room is within hotel property and required their coordination for the PIN setup." Chen paused. "And anyone who had administrative access to the hotel's security credential system." They looked at each other. "I need to tell Ms. Voss," Chen said. "Tell her carefully," Brennan said. "She just inhaled smoke for 8 minutes, and the paramedics are trying to keep a mask on her face." Chen almost smiled. It was a very small almost, gone before it fully arrived. He moved toward the ambulance. Brennan stood at the edge of the perimeter and looked at the building. The fire was being contained. He could see it in the way the firefighters were repositioning, the change in radio traffic, the fact that the orange glow that had been visible in the upper east windows 20 minutes ago had dimmed to a dull flicker. The structure was holding. Whatever Roland Keswick's maintenance shortcuts had cost, the building itself had been built solidly enough that the fire hadn't propagated the way it might have in a structure with more compromised bones. Small mercies. He took out his phone and called Tessa. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Checked the time 11:17 at night. She was asleep. He thought about calling again and decided against it. There was nothing she needed to know tonight that couldn't wait until morning, and waking her up to tell her he was fine would only tell her there was a reason she might have been worried. He texted instead, "Everything's okay. Call me when you're up. Don't panic about any news you see. I'm fine. Love you." He stood looking at the text for a moment after he sent it. The "love you" was a recent addition to their exchanges. About a year ago, he'd started just signing off with it plainly, without the self-conscious qualifier he used to add, the "you know I" or the "obviously." She never responded to it directly, but she'd stopped responding to it with silence, too. She'd started responding with a thumbs-up emoji, which from Tessa was the equivalent of a paragraph. He put the phone away. Across the perimeter, near the hotel's main entrance, where the police presence was thickest, he spotted Roland Keswick for the first time since the executive suite meeting that morning. Roland was standing with 2 men who had the look of attorneys, not because of anything specific about their clothes, but because of the particular way they were positioned relative to Roland, close but not intimate, attentive without being servile, the professional proximity of people who were being paid by the hour to be there. Roland was speaking to one of them with controlled animation, his hands making small, precise gestures, and even from this distance, Brennan could see the quality of his composure, not rattled, not frightened, not the posture of a building owner who had just watched his property catch fire. Calculating. That was the word. Looked like a man calculating. Then Roland turned, and his eyes found Brennan across the crowd. The look lasted only a moment, but in that moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with the emergency around them and everything to do with the conversation that morning, and the inspection report, and the particular fact that Brennan was standing outside the building instead of trapped inside it. Roland turned back to his attorneys. 15 minutes later, the accusation arrived. It came through an officer named Patton who approached Brennan at the perimeter with the slightly apologetic manner of someone who has been asked to deliver a message he finds uncomfortable. "Mr. Daxley, we need you to come with me for a conversation." "What kind of conversation?" "Mr. Keswick has indicated to the lead investigator that you had unrestricted access to this building's mechanical systems today, and he'd like that access formally accounted for." Brennan looked at him. "I had authorized inspection access. That's documented through the City Building Authority office." I submitted a preliminary verbal report to Code Enforcement Supervisor Dana Reese at approximately 2:15 this afternoon. I understand. This is just a formality. It's not a formality, Brennan said. It's a deflection. But I'll talk to your investigator. He talked to the investigator, a detective named Solis, who was professional and unhurried, and asked his questions with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to signal what he was thinking before he was ready to signal it. Brennan answered everything directly: his inspection timeline, what he'd found and documented, his report to Dana Reese, his return to the building, everything he'd done during the evacuation, and the man he'd seen on the 12th floor. Solis wrote everything down and said he'd be in touch. Brennan stepped out of the interview area, a folding table set up near the command unit, and found Marielle standing 20 feet away. She had won the argument with the paramedics, apparently. She was standing without support, her hair carrying the particular dishevelment of someone who had been through something physical and hadn't had time to address it, and her eyes were still slightly red at the rims. She was holding a paper cup of something hot with both hands. She had found a jacket somewhere not hers, too large, probably borrowed from one of her security team, and she was wearing it over the clothes she'd had on that morning, which now bore the gray-brown marks of smoke contact along the collar and left sleeve. She looked, in other words, like a person who had nearly died in a burning building 3 hours ago, which was accurate. "They talked to you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Keswick's pointing at me," Brennan said. "I had building access today. He's going to use that." She stopped. Whatever she'd been about to say, she reconsidered it. "Chen told me about the prototype. I know. If that case is what I think it is, and if someone has removed it from this building," she stopped again. The paper cup crinkled slightly under the pressure of her grip. "The technology in that unit is not commercially available. It's not finalized. It is specifically designed for one military application that currently has no equivalent in any other system, and if it ends up in the wrong hands," she looked at him. "It's not just a theft. It's a compromise of something that took 4 years and $40 million to develop." "I understand," Brennan said. "Do the police understand?" "Captain Oduya is aware." I told her what I saw. He paused. "They've tightened the perimeter. If the case is still within the sealed block, they'll find it. And if it's not," he didn't answer that, because there wasn't a good answer. She looked at him for a moment. "You had it in your hands," she said. "In the conference suite. The drive cartridge. I put it in my pocket," he said. He reached into his breast pocket and produced the drive cartridge, a small, dense object that looked like nothing particularly significant, a matte gray rectangle about the size of a deck of cards. "I couldn't carry you in the case. I took the smaller piece." She stared at the drive cartridge. Then she took it from his hand, very carefully, with both of hers, and held it for a moment, with an expression that was complicated relief and anger, and something that might have been the particular exhaustion of realizing how close a margin everything had existed in. "The prototype casing is lost," she said. "But this," she looked up, "this is the only copy of the core operational data. If I'd lost this." "You didn't," he said. She looked at him. "Because you went back into a burning building. Because you were still in it." The noise of the emergency scene surrounded them: radio traffic and distant machinery, and the murmur of hundreds of displaced guests, and the periodic electronic tone of equipment being repositioned. Brennan was tired in the specific way he got after high-stress physical activity, not sleepy, not depleted, but settled into a heaviness that his body had learned to carry without collapsing under it. He was thinking about the man in the charcoal jacket. He was thinking about the timestamps. That thought had started small, in the back of his mind while he was talking to Detective Solis, and it had grown during the walk from the interview area, and now it was taking up significant space: the access records. If someone had planted evidence, and the man in the corridor, the specific nature of the theft, the deliberateness of the ventilation modification, all pointed toward something planned rather than opportunistic, then access records were the obvious instrument. Brennan had used his inspection credential badge throughout the building that day. Anyone with administrative access to the hotel's security system would have a complete log of his movements, and could alter it. He excused himself from Marielle and walked back to the command unit perimeter. He asked to speak to Captain Oduya. It took 6 minutes for her to appear, which was faster than he'd expected given the operational demands she was managing. "The security access records for this building," he said. Who has administrative rights to those systems? Oduya looked at him. That's part of what we're pulling right now. I need you to flag something specific. He explained the timestamp issue, the concern that his inspection access log could have been modified, that an access event could have been cloned from his credential and planted against a different location and time. I logged into certain areas using my inspection badge throughout the day. Those entries will exist as a baseline. If there are additional entries, especially entries timed to coincide with the theft window, compare the timestamp synchronization. Oduya's expression sharpened slightly. Explain. Building security systems run on their own internal clocks. Those clocks are set at installation and are periodically synchronized. If someone with access to the system generated a false entry, cloned my credential, and created a fake access event, they'd generate it from a workstation or server with a different clock reference. The timestamp might be off by seconds from the building's primary security clock. It sounds minor, but it's detectable if you know to look for it. Oduya was quiet for a moment. You know a lot about security systems for a building inspector. Brennan said nothing. She looked at him. Is there something about your background I should know? He looked back at her steadily. I inspected this building today. Everything I did in this building today is documented and submitted. It wasn't an answer to her question, and they both knew it. She let it go. For the moment, she went back to the command unit. Brennan turned and found Roland Keswick standing 12 feet behind him. He hadn't approached quietly, or rather he hadn't tried to be quiet, because Roland was not a man who crept. He was standing with his hands in the pockets of an overcoat that had been brought out for him from somewhere, well cut and dark, and he looked at Brennan with an expression that had settled into something specific, not hostility, but assessment. The look of a man who is determining what a problem will cost him and how much he is willing to pay. Mr. Daxley. Roland's voice was controlled and even. If anything, he sounded more composed than he had in the executive suite that morning, which told Brennan something important. Terrible night. Yes, Brennan said. My staff is telling me you were quite heroic during the evacuation. Directing guests, carrying Ms. Voss out of the building. He paused. Remarkable initiative for a building inspector. People were in danger. Of course. Roland looked at him. The investigators are going to have a lot of questions about the sequence of events tonight. A lot of things to sort through. Access records, credential logs, inspection timelines. He let that sit for a moment. These situations can become very complicated very quickly. Careers can be affected. Reputations. Brennan looked at him without expression. I have a legal team that's quite skilled at navigating complexity, Roland continued. And I have relationships with the city's licensing board that go back many years. I mention this only because I know why you mention it, Brennan said. Roland adjusted his position slightly. I want to resolve this as cleanly as possible. For everyone involved. Then cooperate with the investigation. I intend to. A small, careful pause. I'd hope you would do the same. In a manner that reflects the ambiguity of a situation like this. Equipment fails. Inspectors see problems that turn out to be less significant than they appeared. Reports get refined as more information becomes available. He looked at Brennan with the expression of a man extending an offer he believes is reasonable. A contractor with your skills could have a very different professional future. There are consulting roles, well-compensated ones, that open up when people approach these situations with appropriate perspective. Brennan was quiet for a moment. My report says what I observed, he said. It's going to keep saying what I observed. Roland's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. That would be unfortunate. For who? Roland looked at him for a long moment. I'd encourage you to think carefully, Mr. Daxley. About your position here. About your livelihood. He paused, and something shifted in his voice very slightly, but there. You have a daughter, I believe. 13? It can be difficult, raising a child on an inspector's salary when your certification is under review. The specific quality of the silence that followed that sentence was something Brennan had experienced before, in different circumstances, in different places. The silence that comes in the half-second after someone says a thing that changes the temperature of the conversation irrevocably. He looked at Roland Keswick. He looked at him the way he used to look at things that needed to be assessed quickly and responded to precisely in environments where imprecision had consequences that couldn't be revised afterward. He took in Roland's composed exterior and the slight miscalculation in his eyes, the belief that mentioning Tessa would produce the same result that mentioning money had failed to produce, that everyone had a particular lever that would move them, and that Brennan's lever was his daughter. "Mr. Keswick," Brennan said, his voice was quiet. "I walked into a burning building tonight for a woman I'd met 8 hours ago. I did it because she was in there and I could get to her. Nobody paid me. Nobody asked me. I made that decision and I'd make it again." He paused. "A man who makes decisions like that is not going to change his inspection report because you mentioned his daughter's name." Roland said nothing. "Get away from me," Brennan said. Roland held his position for exactly 2 more seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward his attorneys with the particular stiffness of a man who has been accustomed to winning these kinds of conversations for so long that not winning one registers as a physical sensation. Brennan watched him go. Then he heard someone say his name. Not his name as people usually said it, not Daxley or Mr. Daxley or even just Brennan. His full formal designation, the one he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 8 years, the one that had belonged to a version of himself he'd folded up and put away in a box he didn't open. Lieutenant Commander Daxley. He turned. The man standing at the edge of the emergency perimeter was in his late 40s, in civilian clothes that didn't disguise the posture underneath them. He was lean and gray at the temples, and his eyes were the eyes of someone who had spent a significant portion of his life in places that required extreme alertness. He was looking at Brennan with an expression that contained multiple things at once: recognition, something like relief, and the careful restraint of a man who understood the significance of the moment he was standing in. Commander Elias Strake. Brennan hadn't seen him in 8 years. Not since the processing center. Not since the last set of paperwork, and the handshake, and the walk out of a building that represented the end of one life, and the beginning of something he hadn't entirely figured out yet. Around them, the emergency scene continued its noise. But the specific radius of ground they were standing on had gone quiet in the way that ground goes quiet when 2 people are looking at each other across a significant distance that has nothing to do with feet. "Strake," Brennan said. Elias Strake crossed the remaining distance between them and stopped. He didn't extend his hand. He just looked at Brennan for a moment with the evaluating attention of someone confirming that what they're seeing matches what they expected to see. "You look exactly the same," Strake said. "That's mildly irritating." "What are you doing here?" "One of my people flagged the incident when the name came up in the response reporting. Independent building inspector involved in a fire at a defense technology summit. I knew one independent building inspector who would know to ground the elevators and clear floors in a sequence before units arrived." He looked at Brennan. "It didn't take long to confirm. I'm not anyone's person anymore." "No," Strake agreed. "You're not. You made that very clear 8 years ago, and I respect it." He paused. "I'm here because I heard you were about to get buried under a false access record, and I have about 20 people who would be professionally and personally offended by that outcome." Brennan looked at him. "How much do you know?" "Enough to have made 2 phone calls on the way here." Strake glanced toward the hotel. "The prototype that was taken, we've had eyes on that technology for 3 months. There's a competing interest, private money connected to a defense rival, that's been looking for a way to either acquire or compromise the VOS system before the contract decision. Tonight wasn't random." He looked back at Brennan. "And whoever orchestrated it needed someone to frame. You had the building access and the misfortune of being an outsider without institutional backing." "The timestamps," Brennan said. "The timestamps," Strake confirmed. "Our people looked at the raw access logs 40 minutes ago. There's a fabricated entry, your credential, a room you never entered, timed to the theft window. The synchronization is off by 11 seconds from the building's primary clock."
11 seconds.
Brennan had estimated it would be off. He hadn't known it would be 11 seconds. Strake watched him process this. "The fabrication is good. Not perfect. Someone who knew what they were doing, but working fast and under pressure. Because they didn't plan for the fire to go this far," Brennan said. "The fire was supposed to be a brief disruption. A power outage, maybe. Cover for the theft, in and out. The ventilation modification was to direct smoke upward, and away from the ground floor exits, keep people moving up and out while someone went laterally on 12. He thought it through. When the fire became serious instead of controlled, they had to accelerate." The fabrication was rushed. 11 seconds, Strake said again. He almost smiled. You always did read buildings fast. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the emergency perimeter hummed with radio traffic and the repositioning of equipment and the distant sound of the fire being fully beaten back inside the Meridian's east wing. There's going to be attention, Strake said. On you. What happened tonight, how you handled the evacuation. Getting Miss Voss out, that's going to come out. There are reporters already working the perimeter, and you were seen by a significant number of people doing things that don't typically get associated with building inspectors. I know. Does that bother you? Brennan thought about it honestly for a second. Yes, he said. Strake nodded, like that was the answer he'd expected. I won't push anything you don't want pushed, but the access record needs to be cleared officially, and clearing it is going to require some context about who you are. Then give them the context. All of it? Brennan looked at the hotel. He thought about Tessa, asleep right now with her phone face down on the nightstand, the way she always slept with it, the thumbs-up emoji sitting in their text thread. He thought about the man in the charcoal jacket. He thought about Roland Keswick's measured voice saying, "You have a daughter." Whatever clears the record, he said. Strake nodded. He pulled out his phone and stepped a few feet away to make a call, and Brennan stood at the edge of the perimeter and watched the Meridian's upper windows go dark one by one as the fire was finally, definitively extinguished, leaving behind only the damage and the evidence, and the long, complicated question of what had actually happened here and who had made it happen. 20 minutes later, the military vehicles arrived. 3 of them, unmarked but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for: the antenna configurations, the window tinting, the way they positioned relative to each other as they pulled into the sealed block. They came without sirens or lights, which made the crowd notice them more, not less, in the way that quiet authority tends to draw attention more effectively than noise. A security perimeter went up around the original perimeter, tightening the cordon in a way that made the police units look at each other and make rapid radio inquiries. Detective Solis appeared at Brennan's elbow. "What is happening?" he said. It was not quite a question. "The access record has a problem," Brennan said. "Someone is going to explain it." "Someone associated with those vehicles?" "Yes." Solis looked at him. "Who are you exactly, Mr. Daxley?" Brennan watched Strake cross the perimeter with 2 others behind him, moving toward Captain Oduya's command unit. He watched Roland Keswick's attorney step forward and say something that Strake walked past without acknowledging. He watched Marielle Voss, at the far edge of the staging area, turn and see the vehicles and go very still for a moment, before something in her expression shifted into the focused attention of someone recalibrating rapidly. She turned and found Brennan across the distance between them. He could see the question forming in her expression from 30 feet away. He didn't answer it yet. Strake reached the center of the emergency scene and was greeted by Oduya, who looked at his credentials and then looked at him and then nodded with the expression of someone who has just been handed his context that reorganizes several things she'd been uncertain about. Then Strake turned. And in front of the assembled firefighters and police officers and investigators and reporters at the perimeter edge, and Roland Keswick and his attorneys and Marielle Voss and her security team and the displaced hotel guests and everyone who had gathered in the specific gravity of the aftermath of a major emergency, he crossed the ground to where Brennan was standing, and he stopped. The sidewalk in some radius around them went quiet. "Lieutenant Commander Daxley," Strake said. He said it the way you say a title when the title is being restored to someone in front of witnesses. Not formally, not ceremonially, just plainly, the way you say a true thing that has been complicated by circumstance and is now being uncomplicated. Brennan looked at him. "I'm not that man anymore." "No," Strake agreed, "but the record needs to know you were." The silence spread outward. Brennan could feel it, not the attention itself, which he'd learned a long time ago to treat as weather rather than something to manage, but the specific quality of this particular silence, which was the silence of a story changing shape in front of the people who'd been inside it. Roland Keswick, across the cordon, said something to his attorney in a tone that had lost its composure entirely. Marielle Voss said nothing. She was looking at Brennan with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, not the efficient assessment of the executive suite, not the strained gratitude of the woman he'd carried out of a burning building. Something different. Something that was trying to reconcile the man she'd dismissed that morning with the information she was receiving right now, and finding that the reconciliation required more space than she currently had available. Brennan turned away from Strake and looked at the building. The Meridian stood dark and damaged against the city sky, its east wing scorched and its systems disabled, and its carefully constructed reputation for flawless luxury events lying in the street with the fire department's equipment and the displaced crowd and the evidence bags that were already being carried out of the building by investigators who now knew exactly what they were looking for. Somewhere inside that sealed perimeter, in a hotel security SUV that had been trying to exit the block when the military vehicles arrived and tightened the cordon, a man in a charcoal jacket was sitting with a case he was no longer going to be able to deliver to anyone. Brennan knew this because Strake had told him in the last 30 seconds before he walked away to make his call. The prototype was recovered. The evidence was intact. And the 11-second gap in a timestamp was about to take apart a very carefully constructed lie, piece by piece in a sequence that Roland Keswick, standing across the perimeter with his attorneys and his composure and his 40 years of knowing how to manage outcomes, had not prepared for. Because he had planned for everything except the building inspector who'd been paying attention. Truth, when it finally began moving, moved the way water moves through a cracked foundation, not dramatic at first, just persistent, finding every gap and widening it incrementally until the structure holding everything up starts to shift in ways that can't be corrected from the outside. It started with Gordon Pruitt, the facilities manager who had walked Brennan through the building that morning. The nervous man with the laminated visitor badge and the phone he kept checking came forward at 6:43 the following morning in the lobby of the city's code enforcement office with a folder of documents he'd been keeping in a locked drawer in his home office for 11 months. He hadn't slept. He looked like a man who had made a decision during the night and was afraid that if he waited until he felt ready, he would never feel ready. The folder contained 37 pages of internal communications, maintenance requisitions, and facility management orders, all bearing Roland Keswick's name or the name of his direct deputy, all spanning a period of slightly over 2 years, all documenting a consistent and deliberate pattern of disabling, bypassing, or indefinitely deferring safe systems at the Meridian, specifically during high-profile events. The covered smoke detectors weren't a new practice. They went back to a charity gala 14 months ago. The ventilation modifications had been ordered 9 months before the fire, signed off by a contractor whose license Brennan's contact at the building authority confirmed had lapsed 8 months prior. The east stairwell structural concerns had been flagged by the Meridian's own maintenance staff in 2 separate internal reports, both of which had been stamped reviewed by Roland's office and then filed without action. Roland's position had always been the same. In every document and every meeting Gordon could recall, false alarms were embarrassing. Wealthy guests complained. VIP events had reputations to protect. A covered detector had never caused a problem before. The stairwell was cosmetically imperfect but functionally adequate. Gordon Pruitt laid the folder on the desk of the code enforcement supervisor and said, in a voice that was steady, only because he'd apparently practiced steadying it, "I should have done this 10 months ago. I know that. I'm doing it now." Dana Reese, who had received Brennan's preliminary verbal report the previous afternoon and had spent the night coordinating with the Fire Investigation Unit and Detective Solis's team, looked at the folder and then at Gordon. "You understand this is going to be a formal statement." "I understand," Gordon said. "And that your employer—" "He's not my employer anymore," Gordon said. "I quit at 4 this morning. By text, which is not how I'd usually handle something like that, but I needed to get 3 hours of sleep before I came here, and I was afraid if I called I'd talk myself out of it." Dana looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the folder. By noon, the Fire Investigation Unit had completed its preliminary assessment of the East Wing junction box, and the finding was unambiguous. The failure had originated in a wiring configuration that was neither accidental nor the result of gradual degradation. The junction box had been carrying significantly more load than its rated capacity for an extended period, a condition that could only have developed if a previous inspection, the Meridian's own quarterly electrical review, performed 6 weeks before the fire, had either missed the overload or recorded it as acceptable. The electrical contractor who had signed that quarterly review was the same contractor whose license had lapsed. The same contractor whose work order had been processed through Roland Keswick's deputy. Brennan heard about the preliminary assessment from Dana Reese, who called him at 11:15 while he was sitting at his kitchen table, drinking coffee he'd made too strong and watching Tessa eat cereal across from him with the careful, watchful expression she'd been wearing since she'd come downstairs that morning and found him already home. She'd seen the news. Of course, she'd seen the news. She was 13 and she had a phone, and the story of the fire at the Meridian had been on 3 local stations by 6 a.m., and 2 of them had mentioned, in the particular breathless shorthand of breaking news, that an independent building inspector had organized the evacuation and carried the CEO of Voss Defense Technologies out of the burning building. They hadn't named him in the early reports. By the time she woke up, they had. She hadn't said anything when she came downstairs. She'd poured her cereal and sat down and looked at him across the table with an expression he couldn't entirely read, not frightened, not upset in the way he'd been afraid she might be upset. Something more complicated. She was 13. The complicated expressions had multiplied in the last year, like they were making up for the simpler ones of the years before. "Dana," he said into the phone. "Tell me," Dana told him. The junction box, the contractor, the quarterly review, the 11-month paper trail Gordon Pruitt had delivered that morning. She spoke with the measured efficiency of a professional, but underneath it, Brennan could hear something else, the specific quality in a person's voice when they are delivering information that vindicates something they'd been uncertain about. "Your preliminary report," Dana said, "the one you called in at 2:15 yesterday afternoon. Time-stamped and logged." A pause. "Brennan, you documented every single failure point. Everyone. The ventilation modification, the covered detectors, the stairwell, the propped doors. It's all in the log. I know what I documented. I know you do. I'm telling you, because there are going to be people in the next 48 hours who are going to try to characterize your inspection as incomplete or your findings as overstated. I want you to know that the log is clean and the timeline is clean and nobody is going to be able to touch it." Another pause. "Also the access record issue. I spoke to the investigator this morning. The timestamp discrepancy has been formally documented. The fabricated entry is being treated as evidence of criminal tampering with a security system." Brennan said nothing for a moment. "What about Keswick?" His attorneys filed a statement at 8 a.m., distancing him from the electrical contractor relationship and characterizing the safety deviations as the result of miscommunication between facility management levels. They used the word miscommunication 9 times in 6 paragraphs, which is a number that tells you something about how worried they are. Gordon Pruitt's documents, they've seen them now. Filed a supplemental statement 2 hours later. The word miscommunication dropped to twice. Brennan almost said something, and then didn't. "Stay available," Dana said. "Solis is going to want you back in today." And she paused. "I heard what Strake said last night, at the perimeter. A lot of people heard it. A different kind of pause. You should know that nobody in this office is going to treat you differently because of it. You were a good inspector before last night. You were doing good work." He thanked her and ended the call. Tessa was looking at him. She'd stopped eating at some point during the call and was just watching him with her spoon resting in the bowl and her expression doing the complicated thing. "What?" he said. "Nothing. You're staring. I'm looking." She picked up her spoon. There's a difference. He drank his coffee. It was too strong. He drank it anyway. "Were you scared?" she asked. She said it quickly, the way she said things she'd been thinking about for a while, and was releasing before she could reconsider them. "When you went back in, were you scared?" He thought about giving her the version that would worry her less. He thought about it for approximately 1 second. "Yes," he said. "For a few seconds. Then I was too busy to be scared." She looked at him. "What were you scared of?" "Not making it back out." "Because of me, because of you," he said. Something moved across her face. She looked down at her cereal. "But you went anyway." She would have died. Tessa was quiet for a moment. "I know." She stirred the cereal. "I know. She stopped." Started again. "I saw the news and your name and she stopped again." He waited. "I didn't panic," she said finally, with the particular emphasis of someone establishing an important fact. "I want you to know I didn't panic. I saw it and she pressed her lips together for a moment. "I was a lot of things." But I didn't panic. I know, he said. How do you know? You were asleep. Because you're your mother's daughter, he said. She didn't panic either. The kitchen was quiet. The cereal had gone soft in the bowl. Outside, the morning was gray and ordinary, indifferent to everything that had happened in the night. Tessa looked at him for a moment longer. Then she picked up her bowl and took it to the sink and rinsed it. And she said, without turning around, "I'm glad you're okay, Dad." He said, "Me too, kid." She went upstairs to get her backpack, and Brennan sat at the kitchen table with his too strong coffee and the particular fullness of a moment that didn't require anything added to it. He was back at the city investigation office by 1 p.m. The picture that had assembled itself by that afternoon was considerably more complete than what Strake had outlined the night before, and considerably worse for Roland Keswick than even Gordon Pruitt's folder had suggested. Marielle's internal investigators, a team of 4 she'd had working through the night, with Chen Bao coordinating from a conference room in their temporary field office, 2 blocks from the Meridian, had spent 14 hours pulling apart the financial structure of Keswick Hospitality Partners and found what they were looking for on the 6th layer of a holding company structure that had been organized, apparently, with the specific intention of making it difficult to find. A private investment vehicle called Ardenmore Capital Holdings held a 14% stake in Keswick Hospitality Partners' parent company. Ardenmore Capital Holdings was managed by a board of 3, 2 of whom were nominees, their names on paper, their decision-making non-existent. The third was a man named Victor Pell, who was the chief operating officer of Drayson Strategic Systems, which was Voss Defense Technologies' primary competitor for the military communications contract that Marielle's tactical prototype had been built to win. Victor Pell had not attended the summit. He had been in a different city entirely on the night of the fire, at a fundraising dinner with 40 witnesses, which was, Marielle noted to Chen with a flatness in her voice that conveyed precisely how she felt about the elegance of that particular alibi, an extremely convenient place to be. The original plan, as it reconstructed itself from the evidence, was not complicated. It had the clean, functional design of something that had been thought through carefully by people who were good at thinking things through. Roland needed the summit to succeed publicly. He needed the prestige, the coverage, the revenue from the event itself, and the extended bookings that always followed a high-profile gathering of defense industry principals. He had no interest in burning down his own building. What Roland had agreed to in a set of communications that his attorneys were currently arguing had been misinterpreted. An argument that was not going well was a facilitated disruption. A brief, controlled power event on the 12th floor. 30 minutes of darkness and mild chaos, during which a man Roland employed in his security operation would use a cloned key card and a PIN obtained through administrative access to the hotel's security system to enter the Voss equipment room, remove the tactical communications prototype from its case, and exit the building through a service route before the lights came back on. The ventilation modification served a dual purpose: create enough smoke from the electrical disruption to justify the confusion, and direct that smoke upward and away from the lower floors so that evacuation pressure remained manageable and the security man's exit route stayed clear. Brennan's credential had been targeted because he was the obvious candidate for a frame. He was an outsider. He had no institutional backing, no organizational affiliation, no senior colleagues who would immediately vouch for him or complicate the narrative. He had documented access to the building's mechanical systems, which gave the fabricated entry plausibility. And he had publicly, repeatedly antagonized Roland Keswick in front of witnesses. It was, Marielle told Brennan when she walked him through the findings in the conference room that afternoon, a genuinely well-constructed plan. She said this with the particular objectivity of someone who respects competent execution, even when the competence is directed against them. It failed on 4 points, she said. She was standing at the head of the table with her arms crossed and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The smoke irritation was still faintly visible around her eyes. First, Roland's electrical contractor had been cutting corners on the load management for long enough that the controlled disruption became an uncontrolled fire. Second, the ventilation modification that was supposed to keep smoke manageable did exactly what you predicted it would do, pushed it toward the upper floors and accelerated the spread. Third, the military lockdown closed every exit route before Harlan could get the case out of the building. Harlan, Brennan said, the security man, Derek Harlan. He's been with Meridian Security for 3 years. He's cooperating. She said it flatly, without apparent satisfaction. And fourth, she paused. You were in the parking structure across the street when it started. Nobody planned for the building inspector to still be watching the building at 11 o'clock at night. Brennan said nothing for a moment. What's Keswick saying? His attorneys are saying he entered an agreement for a security assessment exercise that he understood to be fully authorized and was misled about the nature of the activity by Pell's representatives. She uncrossed her arms and picked up the coffee cup and then set it back down without drinking from it. It's a defense that might have been viable if Gordon Pruitt hadn't spent 11 months collecting documentation of Rowland's direct involvement in the safety violations. The two things together, the planned theft and the deliberate safety failures, that's not a man who was misled. That's a man who made a series of decisions and needs someone else to absorb the outcome. He needed me to absorb the outcome, Brennan said. Yes. She looked at him directly. I'm sorry for that. You were in that position partly because you were there, and partly because I didn't take your warning seriously enough to create the pressure that might have forced Rowland to cancel the event. If the summit had been delayed, the theft would have happened somewhere else, Brennan said. Or at a different event. The plan existed before I showed up. The frame didn't, she said. He acknowledged that with a slight nod. She was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? You can ask. Last night, after Strake identified you, she looked at him steadily. You knew what was going to come out. You knew that once the access record issue was formally documented and the military context was established, the story was going to be larger than you wanted it to be. And you told Strake to go ahead anyway. The record needed to be cleared. There might have been another way to clear it. Might have, he agreed. But the other ways would have taken longer, and Rowland's attorneys were going to use every hour they had. I wanted it done that night. She looked at him. That's the practical answer. That's the true answer. Was there another one? He thought about it. He thought about Rowland standing in the firelit street saying, You have a daughter, with the specific confidence of a man who believes he's identified the thing that will move an immovable object. He thought about what it felt like to hear that and to feel nothing shift inside him, not anger, not fear, just a kind of settled clarity that some things were not negotiable, and this was one of them. He mentioned Tessa, Brennan said, before Strake arrived. He mentioned her as a lever, her welfare, her stability, as things that could be made complicated. He paused. When he did that, he closed every door he might have had with me. There wasn't going to be a version of the night that ended with me giving him any room. Marielle was quiet for a moment. He didn't understand you, she said. Most people don't initially. I didn't, she said. This morning. Yesterday morning, she corrected herself. When you were in that room telling us about the building, and I was calculating the cost of accommodating your findings against the cost of the delay. She looked at him with the directness that seemed to be simply how she was built, not aggressive, just unwilling to soften something that was more useful, said plainly. I looked at your jacket and your clipboard, and I made a decision about the weight of your opinion before I'd heard it properly. That was a failure of judgment on my part, and it had consequences. You didn't disable the detectors, he said. No. But I had the standing to force the delay, and I chose not to use it. She looked at the table for a moment. I've been thinking about that since last night, about what I chose and why I chose it, and what I've taught myself to optimize for. She looked back up. I'm a person who has learned to move fast and trust quantifiable data and treat ambiguous warnings as noise. That served me well in most contexts. It didn't serve either of us well yesterday. Brennan looked at her. There was something in her face that was neither apologizing nor performing, just accounting. The same way he'd tried to account for things when he'd made them wrong, without wallowing in it and without minimizing it. Apology accepted, he said. The real one, not the one from last night. Something shifted in her expression. You knew that one was partial. You were still running on adrenaline. Partial was appropriate. She almost smiled again. It was becoming a recognizable thing, that almost smile, the one that arrived before she'd decided whether to let it fully through. You're unusual, she said. Occupational hazard, he said. You look at buildings long enough, you start thinking everything has a load rating. This time she let the smile through. It changed her face considerably. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering the formal statement Brennan would need to provide to Solz's team regarding the 12th floor encounter with Harlan, the timeline of the credential fabrication, and the military security implications of the prototype recovery. Strake's people interfaced with Marielle's investigators with a directness that suggested they'd worked in adjacent spaces before and had learned not to waste each other's time. By 4 in the afternoon, Roland Keswick's lead attorney had stopped returning Solis's calls. By 5, a second attorney, different firm, higher profile, had contacted the investigation office to arrange a formal interview. By 6, Roland himself had been formally requested to appear at the downtown investigation office the following morning, a request delivered with the particular phrasing that made it clear it was not optional. Brennan was in the hallway outside the conference room, waiting for the last of the formal statement process to conclude, when Roland appeared. Not at the end of a phone line, not through an attorney, in person. He came down the hallway with one of his attorneys beside him, and the look of a man who has decided that the approach is wrong and the only correction available is a direct conversation. He was still composed. Brennan had to give him that. The composure was more effortful than it had been the night before, visible around the eyes and the mouth in ways that hadn't been there at 11 p.m., but he was carrying it. He stopped in front of Brennan. The attorney started to say something, and Roland raised one hand slightly, and the attorney stopped. "Mr. Daxley," Roland said, "I'd like 5 minutes." Brennan looked at him. "Go ahead." "Not here." Roland glanced down the hallway. "Privately, here is fine." Roland absorbed that. He looked at Brennan for a moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating the available options and finding them fewer than he'd hoped. "I want to discuss the inspection report," he said. "Specifically the characterization of the safety failures as deliberate rather than systemic. There's a version of those findings that, with appropriate context, could accurately describe an organization that failed through structural negligence rather than intentional." "No," Brennan said. Roland paused. "I'm not finished." "I know," Brennan said. "The answer is still no. You haven't heard the full—" "I don't need to." Brennan looked at him directly. "My report says what I observed. The investigation's findings say what they found. Neither of those are things I can adjust, because the characterization is inconvenient for you." Roland's voice dropped slightly. "Mr. Daxley, I want to be direct with you. There are significant financial resources available in the context of a post-incident consulting review. The kind of role that could make a meaningful difference for someone in your position. An independent inspector with your background." "You already tried money," Brennan said. "Last night. I'm offering considerably more now." "The number doesn't change the answer." Roland looked at him for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, the specific shift that happens in a person who is running out of approaches and knows it. "What would change the answer?" "Nothing you have," Brennan said. "Everything has a price, Mr. Daxley. That's not cynicism. That's—" "You're wrong about that," Brennan said. "And the fact that you believe it is probably the reason you're standing in this hallway." He paused. "I walked into a burning building last night for a woman I'd known for 8 hours. I didn't do it for money. I didn't do it because someone asked me to. I did it because she was in there and I was the person who could get to her." He held Roland's gaze. "A man who makes decisions like that without expecting payment doesn't become purchasable afterward because the offer gets larger. That's not how it works." Roland said nothing, and last night Brennan continued, his voice dropping slightly, not for effect, but because some things didn't need volume. "When you stood outside that building and mentioned my daughter, when you said her name as a negotiating point, you made it impossible for me to give you anything. You understand that? Not because I was angry. Because a man who will do that to get what he wants doesn't get to receive accommodations from me afterward. That's just how I'm put together." The hallway was quiet. Roland's attorney was looking at the middle distance. Roland himself was looking at Brennan with an expression that had, finally, lost its composure entirely, not into anger, not into distress, but into something that was almost more unsettling than either of those, a blank, stripped quality, like a very expensive piece of equipment from which the casing has been removed. "My report stands," Brennan said. "The investigation proceeds. That's where we are." He turned and walked back to the conference room. He didn't look back. The formal investigation process consumed most of the following week. Solis's team worked methodically and thoroughly, and the case they assembled had the quality of something that would not be successfully be argued around in a courtroom, not because it was prosecuted with particular flair, but because the physical evidence, the documentary record, and the cooperating testimony of Derek Harlan and Gordon Pruitt created a picture that was clear from every angle. Roland Keswick was formally charged on 9 counts, including criminal negligence resulting in injury, conspiracy to commit theft of restricted technology, tampering with a safety system, and evidence fabrication. Victor Pell was charged in a separate federal filing that arrived 3 days after Roland's charges, originating from a jurisdiction that had been watching Ardmore Capital Holdings for reasons unrelated to the Meridian fire and was pleased to have a new set of facts to work with. The Meridian itself, the building, the operation, the 41 floors of glass and polished stone went into receivership within 10 days, as the financial structure of Keswick Hospitality Partners collapsed under the weight of the liability exposure, the investigation costs, and the withdrawal of 4 institutional partners who had read the preliminary findings and decided that association was no longer in their interest. Brennan gave his formal statement, answered every question Solis put to him, made himself available every time the investigation required something from him, and drove home each evening in his aging pickup to make dinner for Tessa. The dinners were sometimes good and sometimes not. He'd burned a chicken on Thursday badly enough that they'd ended up ordering pizza, and Tessa had been diplomatically quiet about it until she got to her 3rd slice and said, without looking up, maybe stick to pasta. And he'd said noted, and they'd eaten in the companionable quiet that had become, without either of them formally deciding on it, their preferred mode. He thought about the Meridian sometimes, in the evenings. About the 12th floor and the covered smoke detectors and the smell of electrical insulation beginning to fail. About Marielle on the floor of the conference suite with the drive cartridge in her hand. About the 11-second gap in a timestamp that had been the thread that unraveled the entire frame. He thought about how close it had been. Not the fire he'd been in situations considerably more dangerous than a hotel fire, and his nervous system had learned to evaluate threat accurately rather than catastrophically. But the frame, the thing Roland had constructed careful, specific, targeted at someone with no institutional backing, had been close to working. If Strake hadn't seen the name in the reporting, if Dana's preliminary log hadn't been time-stamped, if Brennan hadn't noticed the man in the charcoal jacket in the 12 seconds he'd had available to notice him. Close was not the same as succeeded, he knew that. He'd always known that. But close had a weight that didn't entirely lift once the danger passed. 8 days after the fire, Marielle called him. Not through Chen, not through a scheduling assistant. She called from her own phone at 7:15 in the evening, and he answered it at the kitchen table where he'd been working through the post-incident inspection documentation that Dana's office required. I wanted to let you know the demonstration has been rescheduled, she said. Different venue, different date, 3 weeks from now. The prototype casing is a total loss, but the replacement unit is already in production. The drive you recovered has everything we need. A brief pause. The contract review is still proceeding. The procurement office was more understanding about the circumstances than I had any right to expect. Good, he said. I also wanted to say something else. She paused in a way that suggested she'd thought about how to say it and had decided to say it without the polish anyway. I've been thinking about what you said in the hallway. About the man who makes decisions without expecting payment. I've been running a company for 6 years, and I've built most of it on the assumption that people are most reliably motivated by quantifiable incentives. Clear metrics, clear rewards, clear consequences, and I'm good at that system. I believe in it. Another pause. But it has a blind spot. People like you exist, and the system doesn't account for you, and in the specific situation we were in last night, that blind spot almost cost me my life and my company's most important technology. Brennan said nothing, waiting. I don't know what to do with that yet, she said. I'm still working on it. That seems honest, he said. It's the most I can offer right now. A pause that had a slightly different quality than the ones before it. How's your daughter? He looked across the kitchen to the hallway, where Tessa's backpack was hanging on the hook she never remembered to use until she did. She's okay, he said. She's a lot of things, usually at the same time. But she's okay. She's lucky to have you, Marielle said. I'm the lucky one, Brennan said. She just doesn't know it yet. After he hung up, He sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet of the house, with the inspection documentation in front of him and the ordinary sounds of Tessa moving around upstairs, the creak of her floor, the muffled sound of her music, the particular thump that he'd learned to identify as her dropping her shoes beside her bed rather than in the closet where they belonged. He picked up his pen and went back to the documentation. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary way, indifferent and continuous, and the Aldercrest Meridian stood dark and empty and cordoned off 6 blocks north of where he sat. Its east wing scorched, and its systems cold, and its reputation scattered across 48 hours of news coverage that would outlast Roland Keswick's lawyers by years. And somewhere in the wreckage of everything Roland had built, and everything he'd attempted, a single thread was still pulling quiet and persistent and not finished yet. Brennan knew it. He could feel it the way he could feel a building that wasn't quite right. Something was still in motion. He just didn't know yet what shape it would take when it arrived. The thing about a life that has been quietly rebuilt from wreckage is that it tends to resist dramatic transformation. It has already been through one. It remembers the cost. Brennan had built his life after the military the way he built everything methodically, without sentimentality, with attention to what was load-bearing and what was decorative. The pickup truck, the inspection work, the apartment that was just large enough for 2 people, who were both, in their different ways, still figuring out how to occupy the same space without bumping into each other's grief. These were not things he'd settled for. They were things he'd chosen, deliberately, because they were honest, and because they left him home by 6 most evenings, and because Tessa needed a father who showed up more than she needed one who was impressive. He'd been at peace with that, mostly. The weeks following the Meridian fire were not peaceful exactly, but they had a different quality than the chaos of the event itself, more like the sustained effort of clearing debris than the emergency of the fire. Statements, documentation, follow-up interviews with Solis's team, 2 appearances before the city's Code Enforcement Review Board, where Brennan's inspection methodology and findings were examined with a thoroughness that was simultaneously vindicating and exhausting. Dana Reese sat through both review board sessions and said afterward, in the parking lot, that she was recommending him for a commendation from the building authority office, and Brennan thanked her and asked if the commendation would require him to attend any additional meetings, and she'd laughed in the way people laugh when something is funny and also true. The media attention was the part he handled worst. Not because it was hostile, it wasn't, and that was almost the problem. The coverage was overwhelmingly favorable, the kind that arrives when a story has a clean enough shape to tell easily, the quiet hero nobody listened to, the burning building, the woman carried to safety, the corrupt billionaire undone by his own scheme. Reporters left messages. 2 morning television programs reached out through the building authority's press contact. A magazine wanted to do a profile. A podcast that covered what it called real-world crisis decision-making emailed 3 times. He declined everything. He wasn't being modest. He wasn't performing the reluctant hero, though he was aware it could look that way from outside. It was simpler than that. The attention felt like it belonged to a different version of the night than the one he'd actually lived. The version that made for good television had a clean arc, the competent outsider proven right, the villain exposed, the rescue completed. The version he'd actually lived had a 13-year-old girl at home who'd seen his name on the news and sat across from him the next morning eating cereal with that complicated expression on her face. The television version didn't have room for the complicated expression. He declined everything and went back to work. He had 4 inspections scheduled for the 2 weeks following the fire, and he completed all 4 on time, and 2 of them turned up legitimate findings: a commercial kitchen with a suppression system 3 months past its service date, and a parking structure with drainage issues that were creating freeze damage in the support columns, and he documented both and submitted both, and felt, in the completion of that ordinary work, something that was more sustaining than any amount of favorable press coverage. Tessa, for her part, did not make a big deal of it. He was coming to understand, one of her more significant qualities. She had her mother's instinct for knowing which things deserved weight and which things were better treated lightly, and she applied that instinct to the Meridian coverage with a precision that surprised him. She mentioned it exactly once after their kitchen conversation. About a week later, when she came home from school and said that a girl in her class had told everyone that Tessa's dad was famous now, and Tessa had said he was a building inspector. Not famous, and the girl had said those weren't mutually exclusive, and Tessa had said fair point and moved on. She told him this story at dinner with the delivery of someone who is certain it will land, and it did. He laughed, and she looked pleased with herself in the unself-conscious way she rarely showed him anymore, and they ate the rest of dinner in good quiet. He thought about that evening later, about how much of what mattered happened in unremarkable moments at a kitchen table over pasta with bad lighting and someone's phones buzzing on the counter. He'd spent years being trained to function in extraordinary circumstances, and he'd gotten very good at it. But the extraordinary circumstances were not the point. They had never been the point. They were just the test that occasionally arrived to prove whether the ordinary life you'd built was solid enough to return to. 6 weeks after the fire, Marielle called again. It was a Saturday morning. Brennan was in the apartment's small second bathroom, replacing a faucet washer that had been dripping for 3 weeks, a task he'd been putting off with the particular irony of a building inspector who was meticulous about other people's maintenance and casual about his own. He had his head under the sink when the phone rang, and he had to extract himself, and he answered it with slightly damp hands and a smear of pipe joint compound on his left forearm. "I'd like to meet with you," Marielle said. "In person. At our offices. When? Whenever works for you." "What's the meeting about?" A brief pause. "I'd rather explain in person." It's a significant conversation. I'd like to have it properly." He considered that. "I can do Tuesday afternoon." Tuesday afternoon works. He showed up Tuesday at 2 p.m. in clean clothes, not the work clothes, which felt like the wrong register for a conversation Marielle had called significant, but not a suit either, because a suit would have been performing something he wasn't. Dark pants, a collared shirt that Tessa had told him once looked like it fit him correctly, which from Tessa was a high-grade compliment. He drove the pickup and parked it in the Voss Technologies visitor lot, between a leased sedan and an SUV that probably cost more than his annual income, and he walked into a building that was, from an inspection standpoint, excellent. He noticed this automatically, the way he always did, the correctly signed exits, and the properly maintained suppression system indicators, and the fire doors that were closed, as they should be, all the time. Marielle met him herself in the lobby. She was in her working clothes, the kind that communicated authority through quality rather than formality, and she looked like herself, which was to say sharp and watchful, and several steps ahead of most rooms she walked into. The smoke irritation redness around her eyes was gone. She looked like a person who had processed a difficult experience and filed it in the appropriate category, and moved on, which Brennan suspected was both an accurate description and an incomplete one. She walked him up to her office, not a conference room, her actual office, and closed the door, and they sat across from each other, with the city visible through the windows behind her, and a cup of coffee in front of each of them, that neither of them touched for the first several minutes. "The contract was awarded," she said, 3 days ago. "The tactical communication system. We got it. Congratulations." "Thank you." She looked at him. It wasn't certain, even with the prototype recovered. The disruption, the exposure of the transport chain, the fact that a competitor's money had been directly involved in the attempt to compromise us, the procurement office, had serious questions about our security protocols. "We spent 4 weeks answering them." She paused. "We answered them satisfactorily. Partly because of how the drive recovery was handled. The chain of custody was clean because you put it in your pocket instead of leaving it in the building." "It fit," he said. "It fit," she repeated, and something in her voice suggested she found this both absurd and characteristic. She looked at him for a moment. "I want to offer you a position." He waited. "Head of Risk and Infrastructure. It's a role I've been thinking about creating for 2 years and haven't, because I couldn't identify the right person for it. The position would have authority over our facility security protocols, emergency response planning, third-party contractor oversight, and the physical infrastructure of every location we operate in. Globally, eventually, though we'd start with the domestic sites." She looked at him steadily. "Full authority to shut down any operation you determine poses an unacceptable safety risk. No override by operations management, not even by me, without a formal documented review process that you control." Brennan looked at her. "The compensation would be..." She named a figure that he processed without expression, though it represented approximately 4 times his current annual income. plus equity participation in the company's standard senior leadership structure. He was quiet for a moment. Why me? Because of what you did in that building, she said immediately. Not the carrying me out part, though. That's not irrelevant. Because of what you did before that. You walked through a building in 12 hours, and you saw things that the hotel's own engineering staff and 6 months of regular maintenance had missed or ignored, and you were right about every single one of them. And you said so clearly to people who had every structural incentive not to hear you. She paused. And then when it mattered, you knew what to do. Not approximately. Precisely. The elevators, the stairwell routing, the floor-by-floor sequence that wasn't protocol. That was judgment. I've had relevant training, he said. I know what your training was, she said. Strake sent me your service record. I hope that's not fine. I read it. She looked at him directly. You were very good at a very specific kind of work, and then you left it to raise your daughter, and I think you made the right decision, and I think it cost you something to make it. A pause. This position doesn't require you to go back to what you were. It doesn't require deployments. It doesn't require extended travel, and it doesn't put you in situations where Tessa needs to worry about whether you're coming home. What it requires is exactly what you demonstrated, the ability to see problems accurately and act on them before they become disasters. Brennan looked out the window for a moment. The city moved below them with its ordinary indifference traffic, pedestrians, the small mechanical life of a large place going about its business. He thought about the pickup in the visitor lot. He thought about the dripping faucet he'd fixed on Saturday, and the 4 inspections he had scheduled next week, and the pasta they had 3 times a week because it was the one Tessa would reliably eat. He thought about what it had cost to build that ordinary life, and whether he was willing to alter it, and what alter even meant in this context. He thought about standing in the smoke on the 12th floor, moving toward a conference suite at the end of a corridor that was no longer entirely safe, and the 2 seconds he'd spent processing before he moved. Not deciding whether to go, working out how. He'd never stopped being the person who knew how to do that. He just stopped doing it in uniform. I have conditions, he said. I assumed you would, Marielle said. Tell me. Full authority to halt operations, you said that, but I want it in writing in a way that doesn't have exceptions for revenue impact or contractual timing. If I say stop, we stop. The review process you mentioned can happen afterward, but the default action when I flag something critical is halt, not negotiate. Agreed, no extended deployments. If a site requires more than a week on site, I manage it remotely or I send a deputy. I'm home the majority of nights. Agreed. I keep my inspection certification current, and I keep doing private inspections. Not full-time, I'd be full-time for you. But I'm not giving up the independent work entirely. She considered that for a moment. That could create conflicts of interest. It could. I'll disclose every engagement to your legal team and recuse from any Voss-adjacent work. But I'm not willing to let the certification lapse. Why? He thought about how to say it accurately. Because it's the thing I do that nobody can take from me. The corporate title, you could restructure the role in 2 years, and it disappears. The certification is mine. I earned it, and I want to keep it. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her thinking not reluctantly, but genuinely, turning the consideration over. All right, she said. With full disclosure and recusal, I can accept that. And Tessa's school schedule is not negotiable. Any travel, any commitment, any crisis that lands on a date that conflicts with something she needs me present for, she comes first. That's not a policy exception. That's a condition of employment. Marielle looked at him. There was something in her expression that he couldn't entirely categorize. Not softness exactly, but something that was adjacent to it. Brennan, she said. I nearly died in a burning building, partly because a man I didn't listen to had warned me it was going to fail. I am not going to be the person who makes you negotiate your daughter's place in your life. The room was quiet. Agreed, she said simply. He reached across the table and they shook hands, and it was nothing like Roland Keswick's handshake, no calibrated pressure, no performance of establishment. Just 2 people who had been through something together agreeing to go forward. He started 2 weeks later. The first 3 months were, in the way that all beginnings are, difficult in ways he hadn't anticipated, and easier in ways he had. The difficult parts were mostly organizational learning the company's existing infrastructure documentation, which was inconsistent in quality and optimistic in several places where it should have been honest, and building relationships with site managers who were accustomed to safety review being a compliance function rather than an operational one. He found resistance in 4 of the first 6 sites he assessed. Not hostility, Mariel's directive regarding his authority had been communicated clearly, but the particular friction of people who have been doing something a certain way for years, being told that a new person has genuine authority to change it. He handled it the same way he'd always handled it. He looked carefully, he said what he found, and he let the accuracy of the findings do the work of establishing credibility. By the end of the 2nd month, 2 of the 4 resistant site managers had become, if not enthusiastic, at least cooperative. The other 2 remained difficult, and he documented the difficulty and moved on. He wasn't in the business of making everyone comfortable. He was in the business of making things safe. The work was good. It was genuinely good, more complex and more consequential than the independent inspection work, requiring him to build and hold a larger picture while staying precise at the detail level. He was learning things he hadn't expected to learn, about the operational realities of a company that built systems for high-stakes environments, and the learning was engaging in a way that the independent work, for all its integrity, had sometimes not been. He drove home most evenings by 6. Tessa noticed the salary change approximately 2 weeks after his first paycheck. When he suggested they replace the couch, a piece of furniture that had been with them for 7 years, and had developed a structural issue in the left cushion support that Brennan had been compensating for with a folded blanket underneath and. She gave him a long, assessing look and said, "How much are they paying you?" "Enough," he said. "Dad, more than before. How much more?" "Enough to fix the couch." She stared at him for a moment with the expression she made when she was deciding whether to push further, which meant she was already calculating the odds of getting a direct answer. "Fine," she said, "but I want to pick the couch." They went on a Saturday. She picked something that was, Brennan thought, slightly more modern than the space strictly called for, but it was well made and the cushion support was solid, and she sat on 12 different models before deciding, which was thorough in a way that reminded him of himself, though he didn't say so, because she would have taken it as an insult at this particular stage of her life. He paid for it, and they waited for delivery, and she sat in the spot where the new couch would go and looked at the empty space and said, with a particular sidelong casualness she used for things she actually meant, "You seem less tired." "I'm sleeping the same amount," he said. "I know. You seem less tired anyway." He thought about that. "The work is different," he said. "It requires more of me. That sounds like it would make me more tired, but—" "No, I get it," she said, with the breezy certainty of a teenager who has in fact understood something correctly. "You were running at like 60% before. Now you're actually using what you have." She shrugged. "It's like how I'm more tired on days when I do something hard in school than on days when everything's easy. But the good tired is better." He looked at her. She was looking at the wall where the couch was going to go. "When did you get perceptive?" he said. "I've always been perceptive," she said. "You're just paying better attention." He didn't have a response to that. That wasn't embarrassingly sentimental, so he said nothing, and they sat together in the empty space and waited for the delivery truck. Marielle came to dinner 4 months after he started. This was not a planned thing, which was probably why it worked. He'd been at her office late on a Thursday, working through a facilities review that had run over time, and they'd both ended up in the hallway at 7:30 with the particular hunger of people who have forgotten to eat, and she'd said she knew a place 3 blocks away that was good, and he'd texted Tessa that he'd be later than expected, and they'd walked 3 blocks in the cold and eaten at a small place that was not fancy and was very good, and they'd talked for 2 hours about things that were not work. It was the first time they'd done that, talked without an agenda, without the investigation or the contract or the position framing what the conversation was for. He learned that she'd grown up in a house with 4 siblings, and a father who worked 2 jobs, and a mother who had gone back to school when Marielle was 11, and finished her degree when Marielle was 14, which had taught Marielle, she said, that the timeline people set for, when certain things become possible, is largely arbitrary. He learned that she'd built the company from an initial position that most of her early investors had considered too narrow to scale, and that she'd been told 22 times in the first 3 years that she'd need to broaden the product offering, and that she'd said no 22 times, and that she'd been right about the focus, even when she hadn't been entirely certain she was right. He learned that she ran in the mornings because she'd tried every other method of managing the specific quality of stress that came with her work, and this was the only one that reliably helped. She learned that Brennan had taken up cooking seriously when Tessa was 7, because he'd realized that the act of making food for someone, the daily, repetitive, imperfect practice of it, was the most consistent expression of care he had available to him at the time. That he'd burned a lot of things in the first year and gotten incrementally better, and that he still burned things occasionally, and that Tessa maintained a running informal tally. She learned that he'd almost gone back to the military twice in the years after leaving not for the work. But because the structure had been a language he'd spoken fluently, and civilian life had sometimes felt like being conversant in something without being fluent, the effort of translation never entirely disappearing. She asked why he hadn't gone back. He said, because Tessa was in 3rd grade, and she was reading 2 years above grade level, and she just found out her best friend was moving away, and I was not going to be the second thing she lost that month. Marielle looked at him for a moment. That's not an abstract principle, she said. That's a specific Tuesday. It was a Wednesday, he said. She told me at dinner. They walked back to the office in the cold, and he drove home. And Tessa was still awake, ostensibly doing homework, actually reading the novel hidden inside the textbook, a habit she'd had since she was 9, and that she seemed to believe he hadn't noticed, and she looked up when he came in and said, "How was dinner?" "Good," he said. She looked at him for a half-second longer than necessary. With Ms. Voss. He'd mentioned Marielle's name once, in the context of work, and Tessa had filed it with the file system efficiency she applied to information she considered potentially relevant. "Yes," he said. "Is she nice?" He thought about it. "She's direct," he said. "She's very competent. She's still figuring some things out. Like most people." Tessa considered this. "Do you like her?" "She's my employer, Dad." He looked at his daughter, who was 13 and apparently had approximately zero interest in the convenient fictions that adults tell themselves about the categories of their lives. "Yes," he said. "I like her." Tessa nodded slowly, processing this with the gravity it apparently deserved. "Okay," she said. Then she went back to her book. He stood in the hallway for a moment and then went to make tea. The apartment was quiet and warm around him. The thing about building a life from wreckage is that the rebuilt version doesn't look like the original. It can't. The original had a different floor plan, different load-bearing walls, a different view from the windows. You don't rebuild what was there. You build what makes sense for the ground you're standing on now, using what you've learned about what holds and what doesn't. Brennan had been standing on this particular ground for 8 years, and he knew it well. He knew its limitations and its strengths. He knew which parts were solid and which parts had been provisional serviceable, adequate, but not quite as sound as they could be. He'd been aware of the provisional parts for a while. He just hadn't known what would make them solid until recently. Over the months that followed, things shifted in the incremental way that real things shift, not with cinematic's suddenness, but with the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that add up to something different. Marielle came to dinner again, at the apartment, and Brennan made pasta that was neither burned nor exceptional, and Tessa was polite in the careful way she was polite when she was actually paying close attention, asking questions that seemed casual and were not. Marielle answered them directly, without performing warmth she didn't feel or manufacturing an easier version of herself for the audience. She was who she was, direct, a little formal at first, genuinely curious about Tessa's reading, and less comfortable with the conversation than she was with most conversations. Tessa noticed the discomfort. She mentioned it to Brennan afterward, not unkindly. She was nervous, Tessa said. She was, he agreed. Tessa appeared to find this both surprising and significant. "That's actually kind of good," she said, and went back to her room, and Brennan stood in the kitchen and thought about that for a moment, before he started washing the dishes. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't smooth because real things aren't smooth, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either describing the highlights or hasn't been paying attention to the low parts. There were evenings when the three of them were awkward in ways that nobody managed gracefully. There were times when Tessa retreated into the monosyllabic distance of a teenager who needed space that nobody had done anything wrong to need. There were times when Marielle's instinct toward efficiency ran directly into the fact that grief and adjustment and the rebuilding of a family's shape don't have a project timeline and don't respond to direct intervention. Brennan had to tell Marielle this once, plainly, in a conversation that was uncomfortable for both of them and necessary for both of them. She listened. She didn't argue. She said, "I know that. I'm still learning what knowing it looks like in practice." That was honest. He could work with honest. Tessa, for her part, did not thaw quickly or completely because she was her mother's daughter and her father's, which meant she was perceptive and stubborn in approximately equal measure. But she thawed, incrementally and genuinely, in the way that permanent things happen not all at once, but into accumulated small moments that don't announce themselves as turning points until you look back at them. The moment Brennan looked back on afterward was a Sunday in early spring. Tessa had a school project requiring research on structural engineering, a topic she had picked. He was almost certain, partly because she knew he could help, and Marielle had come over, and the three of them had ended up at the kitchen table with Tessa's laptop and a scattered collection of reference materials. And Marielle had started explaining load distribution in terms of supply chain logistics, which was her native language, and Tessa had started explaining it back in her own terms, which were sharper than they should have been for a 13-year-old. And at some point, Brennan had become unnecessary to the conversation and had just sat at the end of the table with his coffee and watched the two of them argue productively about the difference between structural redundancy and seismic resilience. Tessa had been wrong about one thing, and Marielle had told her so directly, without softening it, and Tessa had looked at her for a moment and then said, "Okay, but then how do you account for?" And they were off again. He thought about his wife. He thought about her the way he always did not, with the sharp-edged grief of the early years, but with the steadier ache of someone who has learned to carry a weight without being defined by it. She would have liked Marielle, he thought. She would have found her direct and occasionally exhausting and fundamentally worth the effort. She would have looked at Tessa holding her own in an argument with a CEO, and she would have looked at Brennan across the room with an expression that said that she gets that from me, and she would not have been entirely wrong. He looked at Tessa across the table. She was frowning at the laptop with the focused intensity she brought to things she actually cared about. She was 13, and she was his daughter, and she was becoming in front of him a person he was going to be proud of for reasons that had nothing to do with him. He thought about what it meant not in the abstract, not as a principle, but as a fact about how he'd spent the last 8 years and what they'd produced. He'd left a career that had defined him. He'd built a smaller life, deliberately, around one person who needed him to be present more than she needed him to be impressive. He'd driven an old truck and worn inexpensive work boots and carried a clipboard into rooms where people looked at him and saw exactly what they expected to see. And he'd been fine with that. He'd been more than fine. Because the work he was doing, the daily, unspectacular work of raising a child who was becoming a person, was the most consequential work he'd ever done. And he'd known that, even on the hard days, even on the days when she wouldn't look up from her phone, or when he burned the chicken, or when the faucet dripped for 3 weeks because he couldn't find 2 hours to fix it. What he hadn't planned for was that choosing the smaller life would eventually open into a larger one. That the building inspector with the worn jacket and the clipboard would end up in a position where his work mattered at a different scale. That the person who'd forced the delay nobody wanted would be the same person anyone wanted in the room when it actually counted. He hadn't planned for Marielle either. But then, the things that are genuinely good for you rarely arrive announced. He thought about something she'd said to him months earlier, in the conversation after her phone call about the blind spot in her system, about people like him who existed outside the quantifiable incentive structure and whom the system didn't account for. She'd been working on it since then. He'd watched her work on it not perfectly, because she was not a person who did anything without rigor, and the rigor sometimes made the softness harder than it needed to be, but genuinely. She showed up differently now than she had in the executive suite that morning. Not unrecognizably different, just wider. More willing to let the thing in front of her be more complicated than the category she'd put it in. He'd watched her learn that Tessa was not a logistical variable to be managed, but a person to be known, and that being known by a 13-year-old required a patience and an authenticity that couldn't be optimized. He'd watched Tessa slowly let herself be known back, not as a replacement for anything that had been lost, as something that was its own thing, a new presence in the particular shape of their small family. which had its own load-bearing walls and its own floor plan that was not like anything that had come before it. On a Thursday evening in late spring, Brennan walked out of the Voss Technologies building at 5:45 early by his recent standards, the facilities review having resolved more quickly than anticipated, and went down to the visitor lot. The pickup was where he'd left it. It was still aging, still slightly dinged along the passenger side from a parking lot incident 2 winters ago that he'd never gotten around to having fixed. Tessa had suggested once that he get a new truck now that he could afford one, and he'd thought about it and decided against it. He liked this truck. He knew how it handled. He knew which vents ran cold and which dashboard light was cosmetic rather than functional. There was something to be said for a thing you knew well. Marielle was leaning against the passenger door. She wasn't in her work clothes. It was late enough in the day that she'd had time to change, and she was in something less formal, and she looked like a person rather than a CEO, which was a distinction that mattered more than it probably should have. She had her arms crossed against the evening chill, and she was looking at her phone, and she looked up when he came across the lot. "You said 5:30, she said. "I said approximately 5:30.
You said 5:30.
I was 15 minutes off. He reached past her to unlock the passenger door. By inspection standards, that's within tolerance. I'll add it to the review. He opened the door and she got in, and he walked around to the driver's side. Tessa was at a friend's house until 8, a development that had occurred gradually and was still new enough that Brennan found it both good and slightly disorienting. The way all evidence of his daughter's expanding independence was good and slightly disorienting. He started the engine. The pickup made the sound it always made, reliable, if not elegant. "Where are we going?" Marielle said. "Dinner," he said. "The place on Clement Street. The one you said was overrated." "The one I said was overrated, and then we went to, and it wasn't." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved in the direction of the almost smile that over the months had stopped being almost. "You never actually admitted it wasn't overrated." "I ordered from it twice," he said. "That's an admission." She looked out the window as he pulled out of the lot. The city was doing its early evening thing, the light going golden and low, the traffic thickening, the particular energy of a place shifting from its working hours into something looser. He drove without hurrying. "Chen asked me today if I thought the position was working out," she said. "What did you say?" I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. He asked if I thought it was going to stay working out, given he used the phrase complexity of the situation. He was being diplomatic. "What did you say?" I said complexity wasn't the problem. She turned to look at him. I said the problem I was used to was people who looked at something complicated and decided it wasn't worth the effort. That this was the opposite of that problem. He drove. "Is it?" she asked. Not anxious, genuinely asking the way she asked things she actually wanted to know the answer to. "Is it what?" "Worth it, the effort." She held his gaze for a moment. "You had a life that worked. A specific, deliberate life that you built for good reasons. I'm aware that I've complicated it." He thought about the kitchen table on the Sunday morning with Tessa and the structural engineering project. He thought about the new couch and the pasta and the dripping faucet he'd finally fixed, and the mornings that started the same as they always had, the same routine, the same pickup, the same apartment but with a quality in them, now that he didn't have a precise word for and didn't particularly need one. "You've complicated it," he said. "Yes, but there's a kind of complicated that means broken," he said, "and there's a kind of complicated that means more weight-bearing than it was before." He glanced at her. "The second kind is better. The structure's stronger when there's more to hold." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that a building metaphor?" "Yes. You use those constantly. I'm a building inspector." "You're the head of risk and infrastructure for a defense technology company." "I'm a building inspector," he said again, "who is also the head of risk and infrastructure. Both things." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that had moved, over the months, from the evaluating assessment of the executive suite to something warmer and less guarded, and more like the face of a person who has found the thing that makes the effort of showing up feel worth what it costs. "Both things," she said. "Both things," he agreed. The pickup moved through the evening city, and the light was good the way. Evening light sometimes is not perfect, not cinematic, just the ordinary gold of a day ending without incident, which is its own kind of gift when you know what days that don't end that way look like. There is a version of this story that ends with a ceremony or a job title or a public moment of vindication. Those things happened, the charges were filed, the verdict came, the contract was signed, the commendation was issued, and they were real, and they mattered, and then they became part of the past the way all events eventually do, absorbed into the ongoing accumulation of what a life is made of. But the things that stay with Brennan, the things that have weight when he takes them out and looks at them, are not the public moments. They are the kitchen table and the complicated expression on his daughter's face the morning after the fire. They are the 11-second gap in a timestamp that told him someone had been sloppy in their certainty that he was nothing. They are Marielle in the smoke-damaged hallway saying, "I dismissed you without softening it," because she was the kind of person who said true things plainly even when they reflected badly on herself. They are Tessa, at 14 now, telling him, one evening, that she'd decided she wanted to study civil engineering, and the look on her face when she said it, not asking for his approval, not performing her interests for his benefit, just telling him a true thing about who she was becoming. He'd said, "That's a good field." She'd said, "I know. I did the research." Of course she had. He drove home that evening with Marielle in the passenger's seat and the city going quiet around them, and he thought about what it meant to choose the smaller life and find, years later, that the smaller life had been the foundation for everything that came after. Not a consolation prize, not a compromise, the actual load-bearing structure, without which none of the rest would have had anywhere to stand. He had worn a uniform that commanded silence. He had carried a title that could stop a room. He had done work that most people would never know about, in places that didn't appear on maps, and he had been good at it, and it had cost him things he hadn't fully accounted for until later. None of that was gone. It was all still in him, the training, the instinct, the capacity to read a dangerous situation and move through it without losing his head. The 12th floor of the Aldercrest Meridian had proven that clearly enough. But it was not the point of him. It had never been the point of him. He pulled into the parking spot in front of the apartment building and killed the engine, and the pickup settled with its familiar sound, and Marielle looked over at him with the expression she had now. That was not the almost smile, but the thing itself, and the evening was ordinary and complete and more than enough. He was home before 8, for the first time in a long time, and then again the next day, and the day after that he did not miss dinner.